questionable coaching decisions in one of the games of the year and everything else we saw in Week 12. That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work at RotoViz. Shawn, I think we'll start today with the Bills-Eagles game. It was a fun one. Went to OT. Obviously, two of the top teams in the league. The Bills, backs against the wall, 6-5. Win-loss record not really reflective of who they've been to this point. Eagles 9-1, best team in the league. I think by 2 games in the loss column over any other team in football. I don't think there's any 2-loss teams yet still at this stage. I'm checking that as I'm stalling right now. Yeah, there is not. So 2 games up on every other team in the league. Great hosting to start the show. But they were able to pull it out, even though, hey, they had losses to give, is sort of the point I guess I'm implying. The Bills did not. They take another loss. They fall to 6-6. They become, I saw a tweet, one of those where I was just scrolling and I don't know who sent it. It's a great stat. I wish I could give the credit. A tweet that said, through 12 games, the 2023 Bills are the highest point differential 6-loss team in NFL history. So 6-6 or worse win-loss record. Their point differential just above 100 points. I think it's like 105, plus 105, plus 101, something like that. The team with the highest point differential with at least 5 losses through 12 games in NFL history is the 2021 Bills, who were 7-5 through 12 games and had a plus 140 something differential. So they were even better. The record was not much better. A lot of questions on Twitter and, during the game, really through Sean McDermott's last couple of years. This overtime loss, I think for a lot of people, for a variety of reasons, brought to mind the Chiefs-Bills game, which was just such an integral game for this era of the Bills.
So then now we can conclusively say, right, that even if the Bills had a possession, they would have still lost. I mean,
well, they wouldn't have taken the possession, I don't think. So one of the big things that happens at the end of this Bills-Eagles game is with 20 seconds left.
You don't think they would have kicked a field goal down 7 in overtime? I'm sorry. Back to your train of thought.
They might have. With 20 seconds left in regulation, they chose to kneel out regulation rather than attack. That Chiefs game, it called to mind that Chiefs game for me because famously the Chiefs had, 17 seconds and got into field goal range to force overtime in that game. 2 passes.
I thought it was even fewer than that, but yeah, it was.
Maybe it is.
I thought it was 13 seconds. Either way, it was extraordinary. It was impossible, and the Chiefs pulled it off. But even though that is such a unique outcome, it definitely is a situation where when you've seen that happen to you and you have the team that the Bills had, then they gained over 500 yards today. Now, granted, part of that's because they ran 92 plays. But, I mean, you have to have those plays ready. And no team attacks down the field better. And I'm not talking statistically. You can talk about aesthetically. You can talk about Josh Allen's arm. You can talk about the variety of weapons he has at his disposal. You can talk about either play caller. People always talk about there are no plays in the playbook for this situation, that situation, other situation. The Bills have plays they can run for anything. They certainly should have had plays they can run for this.
Yeah, no question. And it was 13 seconds. It was 17 seconds when Allen hit Gabe Davis or when they snapped the ball to take the lead. And then after they kicked off, there's 13 seconds remaining for the Chiefs. You'd think the team that was on the other end of that famously would have some hope when they get the ball back with 20 seconds, as you were just describing. And they do have answers for everything. And they did look like the better team against Philadelphia throughout the first 3 quarters, the bulk of this game. And even, frankly, late. I mean, I didn't feel like the Eagles, even on some of their touchdown scoring drives, were dominant offensively. They were kind of getting it done, whereas the Bills did feel almost like the only team that could stop them was themselves. They did have a very crucial interception after Philly cut it from 24-14 to 24-21. They throw a pick in their own territory, and they give the Eagles a short field. They're able to score. Not without a little drama there. They lost 5 yards on their first 2 snaps, and they have a 3rd and 15, and they're able to score on a 3rd and 15, the Eagles. But they were able to go from down 10 to up 4 thanks to, a long drive and then a quick interception and then, a touchdown on a short field right behind that. The Bills eventually take the lead back. The Eagles get near field goal range, and then they're a mess. They try like a QB sneak to try to just get into field goal range, but they're out of timeouts. They're doing it, or they end up using their last timeout on 3rd down with 30 seconds on the clock. I thought they should have tried to hurry up on that play. I understand it is 3rd down, but it left them in a situation where if they ran a 3rd down play and the clock was running, they weren't going to be able to spike, and they were going to have to run their field goal team onto the field. Instead, they got an incomplete pass on 3rd down and run their field goal team out there anyway for a very long kick. And what a kick it was. This is like also a huge part of this storyline and very indicative of what the Bills have gone through. Some of it is their own fault. Some of it is just bad luck and small samples, right? Like Jake Elliott makes a 59-yard field goal in driving rain. Like I saw 5 people say, was that the greatest kick in NFL history? That was the greatest kick since when? That distance in that game, in that big game between the Eagles and the Bills, one of the bigger regular season matchups you can imagine. In those conditions, I mean, legitimately one of the better kicks you've ever seen, right? I mean, that was incredible.
And this is a little bit beside the point, but within the context for me of Ben, this is week 12. This is the week where you are screaming at your kickers all weekend during the games because every individual kick, we had multiple 50-yarders not quite go through. One off the uprights, one from Brandon McManus pushed right. Those are touchdowns.
Yeah.
Right? We also have Elliott, who hit basically this touchdown for us at the end, gets some guys back out there so we can score more fantasy points. And there are a lot of fantasy ramifications to all of this, including with the kick. And, you talk about how this is one of the greatest kicks of all time. And especially after we had a variety of missed kicks early in the day that were, kind of gut punches for their teams. I mean, obviously the short one that was just, pure 2023 New England Patriots, where they are looking to just tie a game and send it into overtime and their kicker misses a 35-yarder. But the one that really...
Where are they looking to tie a game? Because, Sean, if you were trying to tank, I feel like, I'm not going to put my tinfoil hat on here. There were some bad turnovers from both quarterbacks in that game. I don't know that they can convince the kicker to miss it with his, livelihood on the line, but...
Well, I don't think we can go down the rabbit hole of the conspiracy theory with the Patriots in the midst of this Eagles-Bills conversation. But
yeah, great execution on the tank. I'm just going to say great execution.
It's a great example of just how hard the NFL is because you get all of these backup QBs like Jake Browning, who were collegiate stars, Bailey Zappi, drafted by the Patriots. You kind of referenced it on the previous show, 7 picks ahead of Sam Howell because he put these massive numbers in college. And every week the Patriots act like they're going to start someone other than Mac Jones. And every week they remember that their backups also can't play. And the interception thrown by Bailey Zappi today was a good indication or just a good example of just how different the NFL is from any other level, how hard it is, how amazing the plays you're seeing from guys like Josh Allen and CJ Stroud. And speaking of Stroud, the kick that I think really offsets that Elliott make was Matt Amendola at the end of Jaguars-Texans absolutely, to me at least, appears to crush his 58-yarder. But it is so straight down the middle that it hits the main upright there, holding everything in place. But unfortunately, it hits it directly and bounces back. And
it hits the crossbar.
It hits the crossbar on the center seam.
Right, yes. I thought, so you're saying, you thought it hit the pole behind? I wanted to see the replay.
No, I'm saying that, it hit on that line.
Sure.
Right? It was crushed dead straight down the middle and was down the middle the whole way and looked good, but in perfect conditions on a apparently perfect kick from 58 yards. He was, inches short. How much further would that have had to have traveled to kick over.
Not a yard.
Back.
Yeah.
I mean,
probably 6 inches, maybe a foot.
And yet Jake Elliott's, as you mentioned, in those conditions goes through. It was an all-time great play to send one of the all-time great. Well, one of the things weird about this game is that statistically, it was one of the all-time great games. One of the things I think that the Eagles demonstrated in this one is that you need talent, because all throughout the game, it felt like all of their players, all of their stars were playing poorly. And yet it was sort of a quiet monster performance where when you have that much talent, it does tend to come through. And you look at the lines, AJ Brown's line isn't huge, but the lines for Devontae Smith, AJ Brown, DeAndre Swift, and then, I mean, this is the game where if you want a big counterpunch from the elite QBs to everything that's happened with guys like CJ Stroud, to a little bit lesser extent, Sam Howell, some of these late round picks who are going off, monster fantasy performances from Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts in a rainstorm, and in part, obviously, because they face each other. And this is what we wanted to see last week from the Chiefs Eagles, and definitely did not get.
Yeah. Both of them rush for 2 touchdowns and throw for multiple TDs. Allen threw for far more yards and ran for more yards, ended up with the bigger day, although Hurts threw for 3 and had 5 touchdowns on the day total. In the end, he runs for the game winner. That was his second on a scramble. He had the tush push earlier. Both of Allen's rushes were on scrambles. He looked really dynamic. I mean, if you go look at the team sets, you're talking about how this is. I was going to kind of counter and say I don't really think this was one of the greatest games ever. I think there were a lot of mistakes. It was kind of a wet game. It was raining. It was very entertaining. It was well played, but there were a lot of issues as well. But when I pull up the stats, kind of look at it, I mean, there were a ton of numbers. The Bills run 92 plays in this game, 505 total yards. The Eagles 378 total yards only, which is a little bit more normal, right? And the Bills played like that. They played like the team that had 500 total yards, while the other team only had 378. Although the Eagles ran quite a fewer plays. They only ran 65. They had slightly more yards per play in the end, but a lot of that's a result of them being a really efficient run offense. They run 32 times, 185 yards. Jalen Hurts only throws for 200 passing yards on the day. Anyway, it was, I thought, a very, very good game, but I mean, I don't know. For most of the game, it felt like the Bills were outplaying the Eagles by more than the scoreline was showing. They were not executing, and the Eagles were just frankly not playing very well. And then late in the game, we just talked through it. The Eagles wind up getting some points to then make it a close game, and we go into overtime as a result. And those elements obviously become very interesting as you get into the close game late and everything. But I didn't feel like it was 2 teams going at it at the height of their powers for the entire game. I felt like it was one playing particularly well, but not finishing and not executing and not actually realizing on the scoreboard the degree of the dominance that we were seeing from drive to drive, possession to possession on the field. And then the other one sort of hanging around despite not being at the top of their game, because the Eagles are certainly a much better offense than this when they are on and when they are clicking. And, you mentioned AJ Brown doesn't have a very big game in this one. Devonta Smith does come up pretty huge. DeAndre Swift also has a strong game, but nothing else really from the whole off. I mean, like they could do a lot more. Their stat lines can look a lot better as an offense. So I don't know. I guess, like, what do you think about? I was seeing some takes on Twitter about Sean McDermott and where he sits in this, and we mentioned it before the show. I mentioned it to you before the show, and brought up Tony Dungy. It reminds me of when he was with the Bucks, and they went to the playoffs year after year, and it was a really big deal that the Bucks decided to fire him despite going to the playoffs year after year. But one of the really interesting things that happened, the idea was that he couldn't get them over the hump. And then John Gruden came in and they won the Super Bowl the very next year. John Gruden's first year with the team. Now, you pointed out to me, Tony Dungy went over to the Colts and ended up winning the Super Bowl there as well. But he was a Colts coach for 7 years. I had pulled up his stats here as we were talking. Colts coach for 7 years. He wins the Super Bowl that 1 year. His other 6 years goes 3-6 in the playoffs. Kind of similar to the Tampa years. And when you have Peyton Manning as your quarterback, that's not a great. So, I mean, not to randomly start throwing strays at Tony Dungy's coaching career, but I think there are a lot of people in Buffalo.
It wasn't random, Ben. We saw you coming for Tony Dungy.
Yeah, we're always going for Tony Dungy. There's a lot of people that watch the NFL these days that are concerned that Sean McDermott is not the coach to get the Bills over the top. I think that's been talked about for a while. There's coaches like Mike Tomlin, who gets a lot of credit for being someone who gets wins out of weaker teams. We know the stat about how up until this week they had been outgained in every single game, but still had a winning record. What do you think about? Well, I mean, first of all, some of the decisions McDermott makes in this game, the decision to use a timeout to ice Elliott on the long kick, to leave himself then only one timeout with the 20 seconds left when they get the ball back, and then to not even try to use that and to kneel, and then you're just willingly giving up a potential opportunity to win in regulation to just go to overtime. You lose in overtime. We just talked about that stat where in 2021 they were a really positive point differential team, but did not win enough games. They've lost close games in the playoffs. I think there is a pervasive opinion around Sean McDermott and this Bills era that they don't get the wins that reflect what they actually are as a team. And I think this game against the Eagles is a pretty good microcosm of that perspective. So where do you land on all that?
Yeah, I think that both things can be true here, where you have to make better decisions. And this was one of the things that I hammered Andy Reid about again last week on, is that you have to manage the game better. And then I thought everybody understood that you don't ice kickers on almost impossible field goals, because that just helps you relax, understand how exciting the moment is, understand that it's no win, take a couple more big swings with your leg if that's going to help you. I mean, you're coming out there in rhythm, ready to absolutely drive the ball. There's nothing hurried about you. And you're thinking, if I miss this, then everybody expects that. If I make it, then I save the day. And this goes down as one of the greatest kicks of all time. And you have that extra bit of adrenaline going to hit this massive kick. You never ice somebody on something that's almost impossible to do. That just helps them. But especially you would never ice somebody when that second timeout could be the timeout that allows you to be in field goal position yourself. I mean, you're going to be able to run at least 2 plays, if not 3 plays, which is plenty to get into field goal range. When you have the ability to stop the clock, you can attack the entire field. You can attack deep down the middle. You can attack whatever they give you. And one of the things that we always see in these situations is that defenses are also super nervous, just like the offense is. And in the same way that the Bills kneeled, the Eagles are probably going to be doing some version of that on their own defense that lets you get the ball in position. Now, one of the things here that may or may not have come into play is that, unlike Jake Elliott, sadly, Tyler Bass didn't have a great game and didn't look very confident. And they may have just felt like even if they got him into field goal range, then he's pretty shaky on it. But again, I mean, you've got to give your own kicker that same chance, because if you have a long field goal in the rain, there's nothing to lose. Maybe he gets his confidence back. I mean, this just undermines the entire team, in addition to being terrible game management. The flip side of it is that I think that if we're going to make the claim with Arthur Smith that playing these close games and winning in some close games, and the humorous thing is that if I'm understanding it correctly, the Falcons are back in first place in the AFC South.
I hope you're not understanding that correctly. I don't know, but I just want to be clear. I hope that you're not understanding it.
We somewhat humorously today, Ben, made a trade offer where we're trying to move Mike Evans. We're trying to potentially bring back a piece like a Kyle Pitts. The 2 pieces that we offered out in Mike Evans and Pat Freiermuth may have combined for like 50 fantasy points today. Sometimes the very best trades are the ones that the other person rejects. So you work through this and you think about the point differential, and that's almost certainly more indicative of what Sean McDermott is doing than the losses, right? And so any misunderstanding of what he's accomplishing there in Buffalo is going to be a potential advantage for a future team that hires him if we get to that point. Now, it may even be the case that they need to go in a different direction. Andy Reid, whom I just mentioned, is a great example of that, I think, where he'd worn out his welcome in Philadelphia. He'd probably gotten to the point where he was too comfortable there, and not too comfortable, but too comfortable / also panicked, which, I mean, it sounds weird, but those things can exist side by side. We talk a lot about being patient and yet aggressive in, fantasy drafting and a variety of other things in fantasy and a variety of other things in life. I mean, you can be on kind of the opposite side of that, where you're simultaneously manifesting multiple sort of intention characteristics that are negative. And so it was great for the Eagles, who have gone on and have had multiple very successful coaches since Andy Reid was there. And Andy Reid has gone on and continued to establish himself as potentially the best coach in NFL history. And you say you got to manage the game better, and yet Andy Reid has multiple Super Bowl victories despite having not really learned those lessons. So you don't necessarily have to. You have to be good at as many things in your job that you can be good at. Try not to be absolutely terrible at your weaknesses, but really manifest those strengths and lean into the strengths, develop the strengths. The thing that we're kind of dealing with here on all of these coaches is that it's very difficult to get to this level and do it without the quarterback play. That's one of the things that the Patriots have been dealing with this year. Although, again, I don't think it's really Mac Jones so much as at some point you have to put like more than 2 players on an offense on the field. But certainly the Jets, very obvious example there. We talked about Bill Belichick last week. One of the things with Tony Dungy is that, he goes and wins a Super Bowl. But just like the previous coaches for Peyton Manning, how do you only win one Super Bowl with Peyton Manning? Again, it really reinforces what Bill Belichick did for Tom Brady, even if Tom Brady was the main driver of that. And, with Tony Dungy too, you have a Super Bowl against the Saints where the big gap in coaching was very obvious. And people had their chance, I think, to make fun of Sean Payton over the first half of the season. And we're already seeing the consequences of having hired a good coach and how Denver is progressing. What they're going to be in a couple of years is going to be a Super Bowl contender, almost certainly. Right. So we worked through some of these different things. Maybe it makes sense if you're the Bills to eventually go in a different direction. But if you do, you better hit on it, because if you don't, things are going to fall apart, since you are going to be moving off of almost certainly an elite head coach. And then when Sean McDermott is out there, a team that has a QB and is ready to take the next step actually needs coaching. And we know that those teams are out there. You hire him and you're going to be in the mix to win a Super Bowl for the next decade. So I think it can work both ways there. When you have Josh Allen, you're probably one of the big plays in this game too. You talk about all the bad luck for Sean McDermott and the Bills. You talk about that field goal. They, on their second drive, have a 13-play drive where they get no points, and they end up punting from the Philadelphia 40. And you're thinking, well, that doesn't seem like a very good decision. But it was 4th and 16. So what else can they really do? And that drive, James Cook, it's both the strengths and the weaknesses of James Cook, where he beats his defender and Josh Allen throws the perfect pass, and James Cook is going to walk in for a touchdown, and he flagrantly drops it. I mean, that's not on Sean McDermott.
No, that was just an alligator arms play. I mean, he didn't extend his arms. Yeah, that was bad. That was the running back wheel route, Sean, my favorite route in longtime listeners, readers of Steelers Signals will know that I always love the running back air yards, right? It gives us a little more splash play potential. And then the wheel route has always been my favorite route, whether it's from the slot or wherever. But if you get a running back running a wheel route on a linebacker, there's really nothing better. Unless it's when Frank Gore ran that one on a 4th down. 35-year-old Frank Gore, as people always like to remind me, had a little fun with that when that play happened a couple of years back. Shout out Adam Gase for that memory. I loved your point. There's so many details that we can't really articulate that go into what makes a great coach. And we were talking a little bit beforehand. I talked about how I've had some issues with Pete Carroll as the Seahawks head coach, someone that, I live in this Northwest area and have a lot of people that, in my personal life that are big Seahawks fans. I sort of root for them, but sort of just don't really root for any teams. because of, work in the space. But I find myself talking about the Seahawks more than any other team because that's what everyone that I know wants to talk about, right? And Pete Carroll to me has been one that, I mentioned to you, I've been critical of in the past. I think you've been a little bit not the word's not defensive of, but you've defended him in ways that have helped me understand, I think, some of the strengths that he has as well. And one of the things I think is true is that while he does have a lot of the weaknesses, he's clearly built positive, cultures, and those types of things get discussed. But whatever it is, he's getting results out of teams that are not necessarily super talented. There seems to, like, most players seem to like to play for him until the point when they don't, because then you get like Earl Thomas flipping him off and stuff like that. That just kind of seems a little weird. But, there is probably something where, like, that I wondered if he was needed to be replaced at a certain point. It's probably fair that the Seahawks haven't replaced him. It's similar with McDermott where, if you do replace him, and even if you can replace him with somebody will do a better job on the sidelines in game with X's and O's and those decisions. I keep saying X's and O's. Fourth down decisions and the actual in-game win probability type stuff, field goal decisions, whatever. You might gain, in that area, but you might lose in other areas, right? There's going to be probably a trade-off. There's obviously things that Sean McDermott's doing right, and I completely agree with you. If he would land somewhere else, and if and when he did, he would probably have a positive impact because there's probably something about his personality and the ways he does things. The job is so detail-oriented. And it's a way that I've always described Bill Belichick and why I think, we talked about that recently, but why his coordinators weren't successful at other stops, because Belichick was the one that always, I think, had the organizational control and had all the details and was able to oversee everything like a really good CEO or something. And there's people that have obviously drawn that comparison. If you're a head coach, that's what you are. You're a CEO of a company kind of thing. You have to delegate and you have to, but you also have to make sure nothing gets missed. Like it all ultimately comes down to you. What do you want to prioritize among your team and all of those things? And those are the intangibles or what have you that the Belichicks and the Pete Carrolls and the McDermotts do hit on. What we see is just the game day stuff. It's maddening because it's easy. Like, they should be able to get that stuff right. We've talked about this before. It is not crazy for us to criticize it. It's not crazy for other people to criticize it. Most head coaches aren't practicing this stuff. Frank wrote about this. The Fantasy Douche wrote about this in his book Game Plan 10 years ago. But basically, they have a sample size of like 17 games a year and then how many really have the late game decisions? 4 or 5 a year? And then you think of the people that sit and play Madden and they're getting reps, right? Like, the reason that Madden players are the ones that actually understand fourth down decisions and understand timeout usage better than NFL head coaches is the repetitions, right? The actual practice, being put in the situations and then learning what works and doesn't work and what puts you in the better chance to actually win the game by making the decisions and succeeding or failing and getting the feedback. And it would be the case that these NFL coaches would benefit from, being in some type of simulation, whether that's, playing Madden or just like some type of simulation where you have to make these decisions and get feedback on how it works out. And I mean, it's just very clear that some of these coaches who do a lot, all the details I was just talking about, from the summer to planning how you want to install your offenses and your defenses and how you want to, do your whole training camp and how you want to manage the media and everything else you have to do from top to bottom, all off season and then into the season, and the weekly grind of installing game plans each week and self-scouting and scouting your opponents and all of that. When do you have time to do this stuff? You really don't, but that's why they are terrible at it. Like, they're legitimately terrible at it. And it's not wrong to say that. They're bad at it. Like, they make bad decisions, some of these coaches. They actively hurt their team's chances of winning. And tiptoeing around that because we have to have deference for them because they're the professionals is like, that's just like, you're missing the point when you do that. They're actually making the wrong decision. Not every time, but it does happen.
Well, there are a lot of situations too in which they have information. that we don't have. And sometimes that information will come out at a certain point and will give you a little more of a sense of why they did a certain thing. But the other element to not practicing something is that a lot of the coaches have inadvertently practiced it incorrectly for years and years and years and years. And so the repetitions they have reinforce mistakes as opposed to reinforcing doing it the right way, which is one of the reasons why
you're getting small sample feedback. You're not getting an actual robust, like it's only a couple of samples, right?
Well, for many, many, many years, the argument against going for it on fourth down was that the analytics don't understand the intangibles. They don't understand the psychological impact, and they don't understand the role of something that you and I talk about on the show from time to time, which is that football is a game of possessions, and there aren't very many of them. And if you had more possessions, then it would be easier and more obvious that you should take the thing that maximizes your chance for points or maximizes your chances for win probability. But I mean, embedded in that whole conversation is that you obviously should be making the decision that maximizes your win probability and those types of things, even in a game that doesn't feature a lot of possessions. But when you have all of this practice telling you to take the more conservative approach, then certainly at the exact wrong moment as well, you're going to make a bad decision. And that was the thing that was so frustrating last week with the Chiefs, where kind of my rule of thumb in any game is that if you don't go on fourth and short or medium on the opponent's 39 early in the game, you will go on 4th and 25 from your own side of the field later.
Yes. That's a corollary. Like that has to happen.
So we look at the situation and you think about some of the teams that do a really good job of it, like the Miami Dolphins. I mean, you have to have the person who understands it, who has access to the coach, who is helping them make the right decisions at the end of the first half and at the end of the game. And over the course of many going into the half segments and many games and many years, you will steal a ton of victories because other teams are not doing it the right way. Now, a lot of teams have moved in that direction, but because of that, it's even more incumbent upon coaches like Sean McDermott and Andy Reid to not make mistakes.
Yep. That's something I was going to say is, for as much as I was just saying they do make mistakes in this and that, one of the reasons we haven't talked about this as much this year as we did, just a couple of years ago, Sean. I felt like every week when we did our Sunday night show in I guess the 2021 season, it's the first year we did it, we were talking about the mistakes that were made almost every week. We ended up being like a central focus of the show. We've rarely talked about it this year because the NFL has gotten a lot better at this, actually. The fourth down decisions, the models that have recommendations and those things, and they're not always correct, but there are people who are breaking down how often coaches are making the correct decisions by the analytics, by the models, etc. And the models are not always going to be exactly in agreement either. But typically when they're looking at that stuff, they're looking at the ones that have a strong recommendation, a strong go or a strong kick recommendation. Are you making the right decision when it's a strong recommendation, not when it's in the gray area? A couple percentage points here or there is usually, a toss-up. You can understand there might be some extra variables about the conditions in the specific game or the backup centers in or when, all the things the coaches like to talk about that the models don't know. Yeah, when they're a toss-up, then that makes sense. But when it's a strong, 5 percentage point swaying shift, the little things don't really matter at that point. It's you have to go here. That's you're making a mistake if you don't. The coaches have gotten a lot better at those. It's objectively been clear that there are more coaches trying fourth down conversions. I kind of think it's because they're not scoring points as well, so they're under pressure to get points. It's harder to punt when you're we got to get something going at some point. So maybe they're doing it for the wrong reasons. I don't know, but they are going more, and I do need to give them credit for that. And when I say these wrong decisions things, we don't have as many wrong decisions to criticize necessarily, but there are still objective mistakes that are made, which is okay to say, the same way that it's okay to say that referees make mistakes, players make mistakes. It's so hard, I think, for the average fan to think that, a head coach could be wrong or to criticize a coach. It's just a tricky thing. How do you think more than this person who's a NFL head coach? And I mean, that's what you get when you criticize Arthur Smith. Even it's just like an immediate. Well, let's defend Arthur Smith. It's like, no, you don't have to do that. You don't have to defend Arthur Smith.
You can though. We want robust debate. Come at Ben with all of your Arthur Smith. We know that he loves that. Ben, the other thing here, and I mean, as opposed to in some ways the low-hanging fruit of this call at the end, although again, I mean, I think that there are arguments for Sean McDermott in terms of making this play. You mentioned, which I thought was really interesting and really important to keep in mind, is that a lot of these turnovers that Josh Allen has made are almost more of the punt variety, and people don't necessarily have the right kind of calibration for how a long interception more or less functions as a punt, but a fourth down decision that's incorrectly made functions as a turnover. And that's the part that people didn't understand with punting in a lot of these situations for a long time. If we go to some of the other elements of this game that were weird, or just a question I have for you, is there something that I missed in this game? Because the game for me really turned in the Eagles' second possession of the second half. And we think again about how few possessions there are in these games for the Eagles to have come roaring back and to score 37 points in a game in the rain. Now, granted, you have overtime, but a game in the rain where they were playing so poorly and there are not that many possessions. The second possession of the second half, DeAndre Swift takes the first play and breaks it for 36 yards. And to that point in the game, I was trying to figure out if he were injured because he was not playing. Boston Scott and Kenny Gainwell were playing. Now, people are going to look at the final line and be like, well, I mean, he still ended up with plenty of touches. And Gainwell and Scott, only 4 combined carries. They did have 4 combined targets. One of the reasons why they didn't play more, seemingly, would be that in the possessions they were in on, again, the Eagles not necessarily that efficient. But when you have this game-breaking back, and you have Kenny Gainwell and Boston Scott as the other 2 guys, and you're not playing Rashad Penny. And again, here to sort of emphasize just how good those receivers are, with Devontae Smith making some plays late, and just how great Jalen Hurts is. I mean, Hurts could barely walk in the first half. For him to end up rushing for 65 and 2 touchdowns when he's limping all over the place, has no explosion, it's also very limiting to his passing early on. Now, it kind of seems like, as we all know, you get out there in the midst of a sporting event, you really get the adrenaline flowing, and your body can kind of take over and act as a natural painkiller on top of whatever, professional athletes are taking, which is often very substantial in its own right. And he looks completely different at the end. But when they're struggling early in this game, and again, you have a DeAndre Swift, why is he not in there? I mean, they really risk this game in the first half by not getting their playmakers involved at all. And sometimes your receivers get taken away, but you can hand it off to your superstar running back.
You pose that as a question, or if you missed something, you did not. I noticed Benjamin Solak, who I mentioned sometimes, really great NFL writer over at The Ringer, who also is a Eagles fan, or was, I don't know, once you become in football media, it's a little hard to be a fan, but I know roots for the Eagles, tweets more about the Eagles than other teams. And especially while they're playing, and has some interesting kind of strategy thoughts and things like that. At halftime, said, as one of his points for things they need to do in the second half, if I'm not mistaken, it was him, that they need to stop giving any running back who's not DeAndre Swift the ball. So other observers were noticing the same. And Sean, they noticed it because no other running back other than Swift got a touch until that final field goal drive where Elliott made the long field goal. When they were in hurry up 2-minute, they had Gainwell out there a little bit, and he caught a couple little check downs. But they didn't go back to the other backs in the second half. If you go look through the game log, I was just clicking through as you were saying this because I kind of anticipated where you're going with it. Swift gets every running back touch in the second half until that final 9-play, 34-yard field goal drive that they had, if I'm not mistaken. But in the first half, to your point, they used both Gainwell and Scott, and it was confusing. It was confusing to me as well. But I noticed even, like I mentioned, Benjamin Solak saying it as part of his keys to the second half for the Eagles. It was stop playing any other running back who's not DeAndre Swift. It's a key. And oftentimes, his other keys are going to be a little bit more impactful than the running backs. Oftentimes, you won't see people talk about the running back, but that is something, Shawn, we've talked about that is sort of a key, I think. You've emphasized as a key with the modern offenses to have explosiveness at running back. It is one of the low-key kind of cool things that has come from defenses getting sharper and having a different approach and trying to take away the explosive pass plays and everything. Is I do think it has made the running back position meaningful again. And you've pointed this out, that the teams that have a good running back, a good counterpunch, I mean, it makes a big time difference in what they're able to do offensively, because you need to be able to have that consistency on the shorter plays, underneath plays, whether it's passing, whether it's running, and have that threat of an explosive play as well. We've talked about it in terms of the Chiefs and potentially having Jonathan Taylor, if they would have drafted him instead of Clyde Edwards-Helaire, all those years ago, or DeAndre Swift, they could have drafted instead of Clyde Edwards-Helaire as well in that same draft. But they have
just traded almost nothing for him to get DeAndre Swift this year.
Yes,
it's kind of funny the different levels, Ben, because we did have a Chiefs drive get down to the goal line and get CEH. And they're like, all right, if you force us, we'll bring Isaiah Pacheco in. And he did punch it in, because that is also a level difference.
Right. I was just going to say that. I don't think Pacheco is anywhere near, the level of DeAndre Swift or Jonathan Taylor, those guys, but he has been good. He's been very good. And him just being on a different level than the CEH, as you just described, has been impactful for the Chiefs offense in a positive way.
I don't know. I was reading Blair's wrong read today, and his notes about the Chiefs rushing success rate were not promising. But
it's not. Look, I'm not trying to make a case that Isaiah Pacheco's good or particularly fantastic. I don't.
And as you're discussing this too, and again, part of this is that the Bills had 92 plays, and certainly Latavius Murray, I think, deserves a lot of credit for fighting to stay in the NFL and be decent at his age. We've always liked Latavius Murray, but this is a game that the Bills lose in overtime after scoring first in overtime, where Latavius Murray got 14 opportunities. And I mentioned the James Cook drop. Any play that the Bills run can be explosive, except for a Latavius Murray op. And there were 14 of them, right? And part of that, again, the total number of plays, and part of it because James Cook is being punished every game for blatant mistakes, right? But James Cook, 7 targets, 57 receiving yards. He looks like these other backs that we talk about in just such glowing terms, guys like an Achane, guys like a Swift, guys like a Travis Etienne when they actually do throw him a couple of passes. And he's made mistakes that have kept him from being that, and the mistakes have to stop. At the same time, you're not going to bench Josh Allen for that brutal interception. Right. The explosive guys have to be on the field. You have to continue to develop your potential stars as opposed to trying to win that individual game, especially when trying to win that individual game may be the very thing that cost you that game.
Absolutely. That is well put. You have Kyren Williams coming back, going nuts, going absolutely bonkers. We've talked about the Rams offense, but this is another example of where, there's levels. Like Kyren Williams very clearly changes the Rams offense. I think you get him in there and Matthew Stafford plays much better. The whole offense flows a lot better. Not ideal production for Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp in this game, but
I was wondering how much you felt that having both of those guys was opening things up for the rest of them. How much having, Matthew Stafford a little bit more healthy, how much having Kyren Williams. One of the things I wrote in the big Zero RB Universe trade deadline piece this week is that when you break down Kyren Williams' individual plays, they actually look very, very similar to Royce Freeman. And mostly what he's gotten is just more volume. And then you have a game today where Williams goes for 143, Freeman, in part because he does break a long touchdown where the Cardinals look like they're playing 9 players. 77 yards and a touchdown for him. You could see that the value of Kyren in the passing game today, even though, one of my notes was that Kyren Williams has a huge number of drop passes this year. But when you don't drop the passes and you have that kind of dynamism, when you have that, his second receiving touchdown is a misdirection where the defense is going with Puka and going with Cup. And so, the other thing in the game today, and it was kind of stood out to me because we had to play Higbee a couple weeks ago because of a bye. And obviously he scored like 1 point in that game. He has 5 catches, 2 touchdowns in this one. It seemed to me like the peripheral players really benefited from A, the fact that you finally have these 2 elite receivers together with Stafford, and then B, this was maybe the first time this year that I was kind of flashing back to that Dallas Cowboys game and trying to figure out how the Cardinals had won so straightforwardly, especially, when you watch Dallas again on Thanksgiving, because this Cardinals team and this game today, and again, all games are going to be a little bit different, especially when one team is better than the other. And then one team plays up and the other one plays down. You can have a result like this. But my biggest takeaway from the Cardinals is that they are not good. And that's not, you've been telling me that since the first lines came out, showing them as a historically bad team. But even with Kyler Murray back, they're missing a lot of pieces on both sides of the ball. And this is a bad team. Yeah.
And we've talked about this was totally one of my takeaways today too, because we talked about that Jonathan Gannon's actually been able to get some decent results. They've been competitive even before Kyler was back in some games that they didn't need to be, or arguably shouldn't have been. The Cowboys game, chief among those. It's one of the reasons I was questioning the Cowboys a lot early in the year. They had some big blowout wins when they had turnover differentials of like +3 and had some return touchdowns and were up by like 25 at halftime. And then they also went to Arizona and lost to Arizona. And it was like, what do these results tell us early in the season? I think it's become a lot clearer to me lately that, as you just noted, that the Cowboys are a legitimately very good team. I always thought their defense was. I had concerns about their offense, but I think Mike McCarthy's doing some really smart stuff, especially since the bye. The pass rate over expected has been really aggressive. It's been all very positive for them. They are looking like they want to put up stats. We've talked a lot about them. But to your point, somehow that team went and lost to Arizona. Then the Rams went into Dallas, and I thought the Rams were looking halfway decent at that point. And I took them +6 in the game in Dallas because that's when I was still questioning Dallas, and Dallas absolutely shredded them. It wasn't even close. And then this Rams team blows out this Cardinals team, and you're like, how did these 3 things all square? The way that these, but to your point, sometimes some teams are going to play up. That some of these happened earlier in the year, some of them more recently. I think this more recent version of the Cowboys is better than the early season version because they're throwing more with intent. They're doing some things offensively that I think is really making them a lot more dynamic. I think you can say the same about the Rams when they get Kyron back here, when they have Puka and Kupp. Both of Kyron's pass. His first, you mentioned his second receiving touchdown. I can't really visualize that, but I'm thinking back to his first. It was like a screen, and it was a little bit of misdirection as well. Where, there's gravity on a play when Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua are running routes, where it is drawing attention. I imagine Kyron, I haven't looked at it, but I imagine it was running against some light boxes today. There was a lot of things that, and the Rams intelligently kind of threw to set up the run. Like you mentioned Tyler Higbee, he has touchdowns on their first and third drives of the game. He scores twice by the midpoint of the second quarter. And then, Kyron ends up scoring later in the first half, but Stafford 3 passing TDs in the first half. And then in the second half, Kyron hits on the 56-yard run and starts to get going on some of that stuff. I have to imagine some of that, like I said, was against lighter boxes.
The tackling was almost as bad there as it was on Josh Jacobs' touchdown run, as well as the Chiefs played today.
He looked explosive on that.
Josh Jacobs,
I'm going to give Josh Jacobs his flowers.
That was a little bit like an old Adrian Peterson touchdown, where the entire defense is on the line. So as soon as you break through, there's no one there. Except there was a Chiefs defender back who, was it a Chiefs defender or was it like the backup punter? Because that person kind of lumbered toward him and then fell sideways the other direction.
Backup punter.
It was in the conversation for worst attempted tackle in history.
Oh, backup punter. That's good. Oh man. The Jacobs run was I thought was a pretty explosive play, honestly. But
it was one of those where we're obviously not rooting for him. But man, if you were a Jacobs manager today, you were set up for a huge game, and then it turned so significantly in the second half, and Jacobs kept dropping passes. And not only is every one of those an individual point, but you would imagine that a couple of those he might have taken and helped them convert. that would have, allowed some of those drives to continue, which as the running back, you're basically just trying to hang on for the ride until your team gets you down to the 1 yard line. So if you're playing against Josh Jacobs, you may have still dodged the bullet despite the long touchdown. If you were trying to pull back 50 points, you needed a better second half from him.
Absolutely. Shawn, the Bengals, we got to talk about them before we go. I got a lot of questions.
Ben, before we get off of Rams Cardinals, did you happen to see the play where, and again, some of these things we tend to see a little more clearly because of who we have out there starting in our lineups, but there was a humorous play early where it's a roll left kind of situation for Kyler Murray, and Trey McBride comes open immediately off the line of scrimmage, and they're running with each other. And as soon as he comes open, which is immediately, Trey McBride puts his hands up, and Kyler is rolling, looking right at him. And he kind of takes a little quick peek to see if there's a defender around him. There's still nobody. So he puts his hands back again. And Kyler is continuing to roll. And Trey McBride is like, I don't understand what's going on. And finally, after like the fourth one, and he's more or less going to hit the sidelines and put his hands down, Kyler finally throws the ball. It was one of the weirdest plays I've ever seen.
I don't remember this play. It didn't have the impact on me as it did on you, but I have to go back and find it now because it sounds hilarious. Maybe he was trying to push the ball downfield. I don't know. But
Trey did get nine targets today, and he did get a target on that one. So
there was a lot of garbage time for the Cardinals. If you're looking at the stats, I will tell you that I'm going to be making a little note in signals about that because I was going up against a Kyler Marquise Brown stack that I really needed. It was low scoring most of the game, really needed it to stay low scoring. It did not because in the fourth quarter, they just started racking up a bunch of pass attempts. They left Kyler in really late. He was hobbling around after one hit. They're down 37 to 37 to 8, and they have him out there. And
I thought all those guys were out, but they actually were all still in the game. And both on a very humorous note and like a mild note of congratulations, Greg Dortch did make one of the greatest touchdown catches of all time. And then he made hilarious gestures about the defensive back who was covering him. And the team celebrated as though they were not down 37-14 and playing against deep backups in garbage time.
That capped a 10-play, 75-yard drive in the middle of the fourth quarter. The touchdown was with 5 minutes left in the game. Then they get a 3-and-out. They get the ball back. They still have Kyler out there. They're down 23. There's 3 minutes and 30 seconds left, and they proceed to go 11 plays, 66 yards in the no huddle, just completing short passes. Marquise Brown caught like 4 balls on this last drive. Drove me insane. I don't think it was 4. I'm looking at it now. It looks like it was 2. Felt like 4. Felt like 10, actually. Ridiculous.
He had 12 targets today, which is something that we had talked about how he wasn't involved. But Kyler looks awful. So I do expect the Arizona Cardinals to go a different direction and Kyler Murray to be an acquisition for a team that feels like they are one Kyler Murray away.
You don't think he'll be there next year? That's interesting. I think he will. I think he'll be in Arizona again next year. I think Jonathan Gannon's excited to work with him. And they're just kind of laying the foundation at the end of this year for next year. Then maybe after next year, they'll make that decision. But we'll see. We'll see about that. Shawn, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Bengals game because I'm famously a Husky fan. University of Washington Huskies, Jake Browning, their starting cornerback today. Quarterback is a University of Washington alum, played there for 4 years, took Washington to the college football playoff as a sophomore, and then proceeded to throw fewer touchdowns in his junior and senior seasons combined than that sophomore year after John Ross went to the pros. I had some concerns about him. I got some messages from some of my Husky fellow Huskies, one of my college roommates.
Ben, Jake Browning today, almost 9 yards per attempt. Fired up.
That was more or less a message that I got. Yeah. And so at half he had 12 pass attempts and just over 100 passing yards. but he had a long of 35. That 35-yard catch was a pass that got batted up into the air in the middle of the field and could have been picked off if it went the right direction. Instead, fell to Chase in traffic, and then he proceeded to knife through that traffic for another like 20 yards, get all the way to the sideline, get up the sideline, turn a deflected pass that probably should have been an interception into a 35-yard gain. And that was like more than a third of Jake Browning's, passing yards in the first half. It gave him like a 10 yards per attempt in the first half, as opposed to, if you took that one play out, it was like a 6.5 or a 7 yards per attempt. It was like, Then in the second half, he throws a really bad interception, just a late interception right to the cornerback. And then he throws another one that goes right through KZ's hands, hits off both of his hands, the defensive back for the Steelers, and goes right to Chase again. And Chase catches that one as well. So Chase had 2 receptions on passes that were deflected. He did make some okay throws. Honestly, I was not completely unimpressed. But his other big play also came very late on a screen to Mixon after they went down by 9. A graphic came up right before that on the game and showed that Pittsburgh had gone over 400 yards for the first time in, since before they hired Matt Canada. It was a streak of 40-something games. And at that time, the Bengals had 175 yards of offense compared to 400 plus for the Steelers. And then the very next play, they ran a little screen to Joe Mixon, and he got loose for 39 yards against like a prevent defense. Ended up being a field goal drive there at the end of that game. That drive, I'm looking at it now, ended up only being a 47-yard drive. 39 of them came on a dump off that Mixon actually had to tip to himself. It was a dump off that I'm not trying to hate on Browning too much, but this was one of the most misleading quarterback stat lines that I think you'll see where, you have a couple big games, you're going to look really good per attempt and those types of things. But in reality, the reason that he looks that way and where the big games came from, they were almost all fluky. They were almost all just sort of fortunate plays, the way that they broke down.
But if I'd given you 41.5 as the over-under on total plays from the Bengals, would you have had the guts to take the under?
I was pretty pessimistic. That is hilarious, though. They did go under that number, which is horrendous. I would have taken the over because I always, I'm trying to play probability, Sean. If you gave me juice, though, I probably would have bet the under with, 3-1 odds or something like that. It would have been fun to make a gamble on it. But yeah, they did not. They weren't good. They had 10 first downs as a team all game. Like this is, if you look at it from just a per pass attempt line, you could convince yourself that Jake Browning was decent. When you actually peel back the layers and you see that they only ran 41 plays, as you just said, and they only had 10 first downs, they weren't actually able to do anything. And there was a couple fluky plays in that sample of 41 overall plays that then made the stat lines look good, but there's nothing, or not even necessarily good. Jake Browning's final line is 19 for 26 for 227 yards. He takes 4 sacks in this game.
It's really hard to understand exactly how this game worked out the way it did, because the Bengals were outgained by 200 yards. They obviously never had the ball if you only run 41 plays. There wasn't a turnover disparity that explains it. And the Bengals were 2 for 10 on third down, whereas the Steelers were 8 for 17. And you already mentioned how they actually went over 400 yards in this game. Now, it was still not an explosive offensive performance from them, but it was weird to have them finally move the ball somewhat successfully and still definitely not put their opponent away and not look dynamic offensively. I think when you look at the final performance from Kenny Pickett and some of his receivers, I think you finally have to have some optimism. And I think that, in fairness to Matt Canada, Kenny Pickett has not played well for a long time. And that's one of the reasons that he got fired. It's not, the causation doesn't run all in one direction. But, if you look at Kenny Pickett and what he did his final year in college, which again was after he already played there for a long time, You think about him as a first-round draft pick. You think about some of the weapons that he has around him. It would have been, if you don't start to make your move at this point, then you're definitely done as an NFL quarterback. And unlike some guys, one of the things that I've been discussing with people and making dynasty trades is that Daniel Jones, even with all of the struggles that he's had, is going to get a second act somewhere, even if it's not with the Giants. And it seems like it'll still probably be with the Giants next year, but he's going to go the Jared Goff, the Baker Mayfield, the Derek Carr type of route. I don't know that Kenny Pickett has played well enough to do anything other than kind of take the Zach Wilson route unless he gets going. But this game is an important first step. He made some nice passes. And the thing that really seemed to unlock the overall offense, and some of this, is just looking back to the box score, but when you watch this game, the 11 targets to Pat Freiermuth were very real and they were very dynamic, hitting him relentlessly down the seam. We've really liked Freiermuth. You especially really liked him coming into the season. Because of the coaching and because of Freiermuth's injury, we haven't gotten to see whether he was going to take the next step. And so we can't throw away the time he didn't do much and when he was injured, but we also can't throw this game away, which is the most recent game and in many ways to me seems the most indicative. How fired up are you about Pat Freiermuth after this game where just right away he goes to be the alpha? They talked about getting the ball more to Jalen Warren, and Najee Harris has a breakout game. They talked about getting the ball more to George Pickens, and he actually does make a very nice 43-yard catch, or else his game would have been very minimal again. But the star in this one was Pat Freiermuth, not Pickens or Deontay Johnson.
Well, I mean, I'd be fired up if it wasn't week 12 and all of my Pat Freiermuth best ball teams weren't already in. They moved up from 11th place to 10th place with this great performance today. But it was a little bit like, man, that's good to see that I'm not crazy, but also where were you before now? But so
you're not dragging any Freiermuth teams into the playoffs. We talked quite a bit about.
I haven't looked at
get some guys like that in.
Yeah, no, and he looks like that. I mean, I'm sure I drafted a lot of them. I'm sure I do actually have a decent advance rate right now. I'm sure I do actually have some Freiermuth. I was lucky to have some pretty strong tight end exposures otherwise. So I'm sure I have some like Freiermuth Laporta teams. I know that I do, and those are probably fine because they got the tight end points from Laporta that you need. I was just looking at the game log while you're talking about how this game did what it did. Fun fact about the Bengals' only touchdown drive, 46-yard kickoff return. That'll help, right? So you only have to do a short field. That's where they got the 31-yard pass to Chase on that play after starting right around midfield. And so they were able to score a touchdown on that drive. They only scored 10 in the game. You were referencing that the final score was 16-10 despite this massive total yards disparity. Well, the other funny part for the Steelers is they fumble in the red zone once. They kicked 3 field goals in this game, 2 of which were in the red zone. The other was at the 23. So they were all long drives, and they kicked short field goals. The longest field goal they made was a 41-yarder. The other 2 were inside of 40 yards. They also punt in Bengals territory because Mike Tomlin is legally obligated to punt in opponent's territory at least once per game. That is an actual rule. Don't look that up. So, yeah, they moved the ball a lot, but actually only scored 1 touchdown, settled for field goals, punted in opposing territory, fumbled in the red zone. That's how you get 400-plus yards and still only score 16 points. They got some stuff to work on still.
It emphasizes just how unfortunate the Browning interception was, because right before he throws that pick, they were in very good shape to win that game.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it was a very bad interception. It was not ideal. All right, Sean. We went over an hour. What do you got? Anything else?
Well, Ben, so many fun, interesting, exciting games either on Thursday, on Friday,
yes,
or this weekend. We really enjoyed the Thanksgiving slate. The Jaguars-Texans game was crazy today. I watched that game, and I also went back through the box score and the individual possessions trying to figure out how the Jags had won, because my recollection of it, again, is just C.J. Stroud, Nico Collins, who doesn't actually look good, Tank Dell, who looks amazing, and that team being unstoppable. But the Jaguars and Trevor Lawrence did complete some key passes today. for all of us rooting for Travis Etienne. He got stuffed at the goal line on the final play of the first half, and then again early in the second. He continues to not run very efficiently because of their offense. You have a crazy game that wasn't that relevant other than for fantasy purposes. Well, I say not that relevant, but we already mentioned the Falcons are back in the first place. The Buccaneers, if they play a little better against the Colts, are in it. The Colts, making their charge a little bit. You get a couple of touchdowns from Jonathan Taylor today. He's someone who, if you could get him into the playoffs, and Ben, I'm going to be excited tomorrow night as we kind of count down the final moments, because came into the weekend with 2 Jonathan Taylor main events right there at the edge. But yeah, across the board, lots of fun games this weekend. You have a kind of a, I'll say breakout exactly, but the Cleveland Browns have been so dynamic this season, despite not getting any quarterback play, that finally did come to at least a 1-week halt against a resurgent Denver Broncos squad. We have Rashee Rice putting his stamp on the Chiefs offense, and Kansas City scoring 31 of the last 34 points in that one after looking like they might have their season kind of go down in flames the way the Bills did. So many cool things. I also want to give a shout out to the FFPC. Obviously, we do some things with them, so I'm not exactly unbiased, but I was thinking about it today and just how exciting this whole process is. I was screaming at the TV, just, beside myself with everything that happened throughout the day as we try and get all those main events across the line. Ben, I've been fortunate enough. Most of the teams are actually with you, but of my 9 main events, 8 of them were either in or fighting for the last playoff spot today. So that feels like a fairly decent season, and B, certainly an exciting week 12. But then you have the semifinals and the finals. You'll be on the edge of your seat for both of those. And then you have the 3-week race for the $1 million. The FFPC has set this up to be just a crazy exciting 2 months of fantasy football. Absolutely love it. It was a great week. And I mean, it's so awesome to finish it with you. This is a fun Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at yards_per_Gretch. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Signals. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Lines. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. The coupon code there is RVRadio 2023 at checkout. Appreciate all the ratings and reviews you guys have given us, especially as we kind of move into the November, December time period. Anybody who wants to leave us a tiny little Christmas present, you can do that. It does help us. And good luck tomorrow night. Hopefully you get your last teams across the line as well. We love you. We'll talk to you soon.